The chalk mark was small. That was the first thing, its smallness. Not a scrawl, not a smear, not the kind of enthusiastic ruin that children make when given something to draw with and a surface large enough to tempt them. It was small, and it was deliberate, and it had been placed at precisely the height of a standing adult's knee on the east-facing stone of the Hargreaves' garden wall, where the moss grew thinnest, and the surface was smoothest, as though whoever had made it had known exactly where to look for the right patch of stone. It was a stick figure, arms out, legs apart, and one hand, the right hand, raised, the way a person raises a hand to be recognized across a room. The morning dew had softened its edges already. The figure was perhaps 3 inches tall. It looked, at first and second glance, entirely like something a child might leave on a wall without thinking about it. The kind of mark that vanishes with the next rain and is never thought of again. Miss Marple thought about it. She had noticed it from across the lane, which said something in itself. The fact that it caught the eye from a distance, the way a wrong note catches the ear in a familiar tune. She had been on her way to the far end of her garden, where the climbing rose along the back fence had been behaving, in a manner she could only describe as wilful, sending long new canes in directions that served nobody's interests, and she'd had her gloves on and her secateurs in hand, and she had stopped walking. She stood at the garden gate for a moment, looking. The air in St. Mary Mead at 7:30 in the morning had that particular quality it gets in September, clean and faintly cold, with wood smoke beginning to thread up from chimneys along the lane, and the smell of damp grass underfoot, and the sound of a thrush somewhere in the elder tree by the post office, going about its mourning with admirable conviction. The light was low and golden, the kind that makes even quite ordinary things look as though they are being paid attention to. Miss Marple was paying attention. She crossed the lane, gloves still on, secateurs at her side, and stood before the Hargreaves' garden wall and looked at the chalk figure properly. Up close it gave away more. The chalk was not a child's chalk, thick and waxy and available from Woolworths. It was thinner, harder, the kind used for marking fabric, or for notation on a dark surface. The stroke that made the raised arm was done in 2 passes, not 1. She could see the slight overlap where the line had been corrected, made more precisely vertical. The feet were set at a particular angle, not splayed casually, but placed with something almost like intention, like a figure standing at attention. She looked at the wall itself. The mark had been made at night, most likely. The dew had settled on top of the chalk dust, not underneath it, which meant it had been drawn before the temperature dropped and the moisture came down. Sometime between 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning, when the lane was quiet and the village had gone in. She looked left and right along the wall. Nothing else. Just the one figure at knee-height, right hand raised. Then she noticed the gate. The Hargreaves' garden gate was a low iron affair, painted black, with a latch rather than a lock. But Mrs. Hargreaves, as Miss Marple knew well, kept a key for the padlock she attached every evening without fail. She was a woman of careful habits, Mrs. Hargreaves. The kind of careful that goes a little beyond ordinary caution, the kind that comes from having decided, at some point, that the world requires more managing than other people seem to think. The key was in the lock, not hanging from a hook beside the gate, as it would be during the day, not inside the house, as it would be at night. In the lock, upright, slightly turned, as though It had been placed there by someone in a hurry, or perhaps placed there deliberately to be found. Miss Marple did not touch it. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked back at the chalk figure on the wall, and she felt something shift quietly in the back of her mind. The small, specific feeling she got when two separate observations turned out to belong to the same sentence. She walked back across the lane, put her secateurs away, and went inside to put the kettle on. Mrs. Hargreaves found it at 8 o'clock when she came out to take in the milk. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself at her sitting-room window with her tea, and the first of what would be several considerations of the matter, watched from across the lane. She watched Mrs. Hargreaves stop on the front step, watched her see the key in the gate first, a small, flinching motion, barely visible, the kind a person makes when they see something in a place it shouldn't be. Then the wall. Mrs. Hargreaves stood looking at the chalk figure for a long time. She did not make the face of a woman encountering a childish prank. She made the face of a woman encountering something she had been, on some level, waiting for. That was the second thing Miss Marple noted. The rain came in softly after 9, as it often did in September, not determinedly, not the grey committed rain of November, but a gentle, reflective sort of rain that moved through the village like a thought, wetting the rooftops and the lane, and the marigolds in the cottage gardens, and then reconsidering and softening to almost nothing. Miss Marple sat with her second cup of tea and watched it settle on the sitting-room window glass in small, unrushed rivulets. She was thinking about poison pen letters. Not these chalk figures. She was under no illusion that they were the same thing, exactly. But the feeling of them was similar, and it was the feeling she trusted, in these matters, more than the form. The poison pen letters that had disturbed the village 3 winters ago, and the ones before that, the ones that had reached the vicarage and caused such unhappiness. They shared a grammar with these drawings, a specific emotional grammar that she couldn't quite have articulated to anyone who hadn't spent 60-odd years watching people, and what they do when they feel that something has not been made right. Not rage. Not even malice, exactly. Something older and more patient than malice. Something that had been tended, kept alive, fed on the small daily fuel of a grievance that had never been addressed. Someone, Miss Marple thought, wanted to be remembered. Constable Draper arrived at 10:30, summoned by Mrs. Hargreaves's telephone call, and he stood before the wall with his notebook out, and his expression set to the particular professional configuration that indicated he had already decided what this was, and was going through the motions of confirming it. "Children," he said. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had wrapped herself in a cardigan despite the mild morning, stood beside him with her arms folded. "It's the 3rd time," she said. This was new information, and Constable Draper's pen paused. "3rd time, Mrs. Hargreaves?" "Once on the post-box at the end of the lane. I saw it on a Tuesday fortnight ago, but thought nothing of it. Once on the churchyard wall, just inside the gate. And now here." She kept her voice steady, the way people do when steadiness requires effort. Always the same figure, always with the right hand up. "Could be the same child doing a circuit," Draper said, which was not entirely implausible, and which he clearly found comforting to believe. Miss Marple had come out into her garden at this point, not intrusively, nothing so forthright, but simply visible, deadheading the dahlias in a manner that happened to place her within easy conversational distance of the lane. Constable Draper tipped his hat. She smiled and said good morning, and did not offer any opinions, because Constable Draper was not a man who received opinions from elderly ladies with anything other than polite sufferance, and she had long since learned to spend her opinions where they would be of use. She did, however, look at the key. It had been removed from the lock now. Mrs. Hargreaves had pocketed it when she came out. But Miss Marple had already seen what she needed to see. The bow of the key had a small scratch on it that hadn't been there last Thursday when she'd seen Mrs. Hargreaves locking the gate, and had noticed the key catch the afternoon light in that particular way old brass does. A new scratch, made recently by someone handling the key who was perhaps less familiar with its slight stiffness, the way you had to tilt it to the left to seat it properly before it would turn. The key had been used by someone other than Mrs. Hargreaves. The constable closed his notebook and told Mrs. Hargreaves he'd make note of it, and they'd keep an eye out. And Mrs. Hargreaves thanked him in the tone of a woman who has expected exactly this response, and has budgeted herself an appropriate amount of disappointment for it. Draper walked back down the lane. Mrs. Hargreaves stood at the gate for a moment, looking at the smeared chalk figure. The rain had continued its gentle work, and the dancing man was barely legible now, one arm dissolving into the stone. And then she went inside and closed the door. Miss Marple went in too, and sat down, and looked at the little notebook she kept beside her chair, and thought about several things at once. She thought about Mrs. Hargreaves's face when she first saw the figure. She thought about the Fenwick family, who had lived 3 miles outside the village for as long as she could remember, and who had not been on calling terms with the Hargreaves household for, she worked it out precisely, 11 years, following something that was never discussed directly, but had left a permanent cold weather pattern between the two families at every village gathering since. She thought about a parish fete. She thought about a young woman she'd met, only briefly, a Miss Fenn, who had been staying with relatives in the village the summer before the coldness began. A quiet girl. Embroidery work, she recalled. Very fine. She had gone away before the autumn was out, and had not come back. And the reason she had gone was one of those reasons that get spoken around, rather than spoken about, the kind that settle into village history as a silence, a particular shape of absence. She thought about the raised hand, not a threatening gesture, she was sure of that. A raised hand is a greeting, or it is a signal, or it is the gesture of someone in a crowded room who wants to say, "I am here. I see you. I am still here." Outside, the September rain continued its quiet work on the lane, and the smoke from the chimneys leaned gently eastward in the mild breeze, and somewhere in the village a church clock began to count out 11 strokes in a voice that had been counting out hours in this particular corner of England for longer than anyone now living could remember. Miss Marple sat with her tea, which had gone cool, and her notebook, which had 4 careful lines in it, and began to compose in her mind a letter to London. The postmistress of St. Mary Mead was a woman who had, over the course of 31 years, behind the same counter, developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the village's business, not through any particular nosiness, she would have told you, but simply through the unavoidable arithmetic of being the fixed point through which all correspondence, parcels, pension collections, and telegrams necessarily passed. Mrs. Brent knew who wrote to whom, and how often, and in what kind of envelope, and whether the handwriting on the outside suggested urgency or obligation, or the particular dutiful regularity of a son who had moved to Birmingham and felt vaguely guilty about it. She did not consider this knowledge intrusive. She considered it professional. Miss Marple considered it invaluable. She arrived at the post office at 9:30 on the morning after the chalk figure was found, with a small parcel to send to her niece in Torquay, a parcel that could perfectly well have waited until Thursday, but that served its present purpose admirably, and she and Mrs. Brent had one of those conversations that are conducted entirely on the surface, while the real exchange happens just beneath it, the way two people can discuss the weather in a manner that is actually about something else entirely. The parcel was weighed, the stamps were selected. Mrs. Brent mentioned the rain. Miss Marple agreed about the rain, and mentioned gently that she'd noticed the chalk drawings on the village walls. Had Mrs. Brent seen them? Mrs. Brent had. And what did she make of them? Mrs. Brent, who had in fact been turning the matter over for the better part of a fortnight, made quite a lot of them, and said so. They had begun, as best Mrs. Brent could establish, 6 weeks ago. Not here first, but at Nettleford, the next village along the Keston Road, where a similar figure had been found on the wall of the draper's shop owned by Mr. Colville, who had no connection to St. Mary Mead that anyone knew of, except... And here Mrs. Brent paused in the way of a person producing what they consider their best card, except that Mr. Colville had been at the Hargreaves' summer garden party 2 years running, when they still held them, before Mrs. Hargreaves had quietly stopped. Miss Marple received this information with the mild, interested expression she used when receiving information she had already half suspected, and which she found most useful to appear to receive as news. The Hargreaves had come to St. Mary Mead 14 years ago. This was itself mildly notable, in a village where families measured their tenure in generations, rather than decades, and where a family that had only been present since the previous war was still, in certain quarters, referred to as newcomers with a faint italicizing of the word. They had taken Linden House, which was the largest of the private properties on the east side of the village, and they had done it up thoroughly and expensively, and Mrs. Hargreaves had joined the Women's Institute, and Mr. Hargreaves had played a respectable game of golf at the Keston course, and in due course they had been absorbed into village life with the slightly cautious warmth that St. Mary Mead reserved for people who seemed unlikely to leave. Mr. Hargreaves had died 4 years ago. A quietly managed illness, a quietly managed funeral. Mrs. Hargreaves had continued at Linden House alone, with 2 daily women and a gardener who came Thursdays, and she had remained involved in village affairs in a manner that was regular without being warm. She attended, she contributed, she organized when asked. But she did not linger, and she did not invite confidences, and she did not, as far as anyone could observe, make friends. She had acquaintances, she had obligations. She kept them both with the same careful, slightly effortful punctuality. Miss Marple, who had lived in the village for all of it, and had observed Mrs. Hargreaves with the thorough, patient attention she gave to anyone who interested her, had formed the opinion early on that Mrs. Hargreaves was a woman managing something. Not grief, exactly, or not only grief. Something that predated the loss of her husband, something she had arrived with. The Fenwick family, who farmed 3 miles out on the Keston Road, solid agricultural people of the kind that villages depend on and occasionally take entirely for granted, had been on perfectly ordinary terms with the Hargreaves for the first 3 years. Then, in the autumn of the 4th year, something had happened, or not happened, or been said, or not said, and the 2 families had passed from ordinary terms to no terms at all, in that particular village way where the break is never named, and therefore can never be mended, because to mend it would require acknowledging that it exists, which would require one or both parties to say the word for it, which neither ever does. Miss Marple had her own thoughts about what had happened. They were based on the parish fete of that autumn, and on the young woman who had been there, and on the expression on Mrs. Hargreaves's face at one specific moment during the afternoon that Miss Marple had stored away at the time without quite knowing why, the way one sometimes stores an odd detail, against the possibility that it will one day make sense in a larger context. She stopped at the draper's on her way home. The draper's in St. Mary Mead was run by a Mr. Elton, no relation to the composer, as he had been saying for 20 years, with the expression of a man who is tired of the question, but has resigned himself to answering it. And it smelled, as all good drapers' shops smell, of new cotton, and the faint mustiness of bolts of fabric stored in back rooms, and something faintly metallic from the pins and hooks on the counter, and just underneath everything else, the distinctive waxy smell of chalk. Dressmaker's chalk, to be precise. Miss Marple asked to see the tailor's chalks, as she was considering some alterations to a winter coat, and needed to know what was available. Mr. Elton produced a small tray of them, white ones, yellow ones, one clay-coloured block that he said was very good for dark fabrics. She turned one of the white ones over in her fingers. It was harder and thinner than children's chalk. It would make a thinner, more controlled line. It would, held at an angle and pressed lightly, make exactly the kind of mark she had seen on the Hargreaves' garden wall. She bought 2, on the grounds that they would be useful for the coat. She walked home through the village in the mild September morning, noting as she went, because she noted everything. Always, it was not a decision so much as a habit of 60 years. The way the light lay on the high street, and the sound of a cart going up toward the farm, and the smell of baking from the tea shop, and the general, enduring, quietly lovely fact of the village going about its day. There was a comfort in village life that she had never been able to fully explain to people who didn't feel it. The repetition of it, the known quality, the way the same things happened in the same sequence, with only the small variations of weather and mood and season, so that life felt not monotonous but anchored, and the world's tendency toward chaos was kept at a manageable distance by the simple, reliable fact of the post office opening at 8, and the church bells marking the hours, and Mrs. Brent always knowing which envelope had come from Birmingham. It was precisely this quality, this long, careful memory that small communities keep, that made villages both the gentlest and the most unforgiving of places. They remembered everything, and they forgave very selectively. The ribbon was found on Tuesday, not by Miss Marple, by the verger, Mr. Hoole, who was clearing the leaves from the churchyard path in the early afternoon, and found it tucked behind the stone gatepost at the churchyard's east entrance, folded neatly into a small square. He was going to throw it away, but something, he couldn't say what, other than a general reluctance to discard things that had been placed with obvious care, made him put it in his jacket pocket instead, and he mentioned it to Miss Marple when he passed her on his way home, because she was in her front garden, and because in St. Mary Mead Miss Marple was one of those people one mentions things to without being entirely sure why. She asked to see it. It was a ribbon, approximately 8 inches long and an inch wide, made of silk in a faded cornflower blue. It had once been considerably brighter. The fading was uneven, deeper in the centre where it would have been exposed to light, paler at the ends where it had been folded or stored. It had a very small hole at one end, the kind made by a pin or a hook, suggesting it had been worn or displayed. It was old, not ancient. 30 years, perhaps, she thought, looking at the quality of the weave, but certainly not recent. It had the particular quality of things that have been kept, stored, carefully in tissue paper or a box, taken out occasionally and looked at and put away again. On the back, in very small letters written in faded ink, the kind of ink a careful person uses, the permanent kind, the kind that says this is meant to last, were 2 letters and a year. F1903. Miss Marple stood with the ribbon in her gloved hand for a moment, in the afternoon light, with the churchyard elm moving gently behind the gate and the smell of cut grass and turned earth and September all around her, and she felt the small click of 2 things fitting together. Not the whole picture, not yet, but 2 pieces of it touching edges in the correct way. E.F. Elena Fenn, she thought. The quiet girl who had been here that summer and who had gone away before the autumn was out and had not come back. The ribbon was a prize ribbon. She was nearly certain of it. The parish fete handed them out every year. The Women's Institute still had a box of them from the 20s in the hall. Cupboard, cornflower blue on a white mount, with the name and year written on the back in exactly this style of small, careful lettering. A prize ribbon, kept for 30-odd years, and now placed here, at the churchyard gate, near the spot where the second chalk figure had been drawn. Not discarded, placed. A keepsake left as a clue, or a clue that had once been a keepsake. She wasn't sure yet which way round it was. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk with a lamp on and the curtains drawn, and the village doing its quiet evening things outside. A bicycle bell, a brief exchange of voices at a garden gate, the smell of wood smoke strengthening as the temperature dropped. And she wrote her letter. She wrote it carefully, as she did everything carefully, in her small, neat hand on her good writing paper. She described the chalk figures, and their placement, and the fate ribbon, and the key in the lock, and Mrs. Hargreaves's face on the front step, and the dressmaker's, chalk, and the name E.F., and the year 1903, and the pattern she had observed over 6 weeks, and the emotional grammar that ran underneath all of it, the patient, long-held quality of whatever this was. She did not dress the deductions up, or soften them into suggestions. She wrote what she had observed, and what she thought it meant, directly and plainly, in the manner of a person writing to someone who will read it properly. She addressed it to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. She sealed it with her usual seal, and placed it on the hall table for the morning post, and went to make her evening cocoa. Through the sitting-room window the village lay quiet, under its first proper autumn dark. The lane empty, the houses lit from within, in that warm, unsteady way that means fires, rather than electric light. and the elm in the churchyard moving against a sky thick with clouds that might or might not decide by morning to produce another of September's gentle, unhurried rains. The chalk figure on the Hargreaves' wall had been washed away entirely now, but Miss Marple rather thought the next one was already being planned. Holmes had been working on the cipher for 3 days before he knew it was a cipher. This was unusual. Ciphers announced themselves to him. Generally, they had a quality of over-organization, a too regular pattern beneath the apparent randomness, the way a man trying to appear casual in a crowd inevitably stands slightly too still. But this one had arrived in pieces, across different channels, without any of the usual framing of a cipher problem. And so he had looked at each piece individually before he looked at them together. And it was only when he laid them side by side on the breakfast table on a grey Wednesday morning that the pattern surfaced, and he saw it for what it was. Watson, reading the newspaper in his chair, heard the particular silence that meant Holmes had found something, and looked up. Holmes was standing at the table, with 3 sheets of paper in front of him. The first had come from Scotland Yard 4 days ago. A note from Lestrade, forwarded with the slightly apologetic tone Lestrade used when he suspected he was wasting Holmes's time, describing chalk drawings found on the wall of a Bloomsbury boarding house. The second was a brief report from a club secretary in Mayfair, forwarded through a mutual acquaintance concerning similar markings at the service entrance of the club, found by a kitchen boy on a Monday morning, gone by Tuesday afternoon when the rain came. The third had arrived this morning, in a small, neat hand on good writing paper, and it was this one that Holmes had read twice, and then placed between the other 2, and was now looking at with the quality of attention that he reserved for things that deserved it. A letter, Watson said, not quite asking. From St. Mary Mead. Holmes did not look up. A Miss Jane Marple. Do you know the name? Watson did not. Nor did I, which is in itself interesting, because she writes like someone who has been doing this for a considerable time. Holmes lifted the letter and read from it, not dramatically, just with the flat precision of a man transmitting information. The figure with the raised right hand has appeared 3 times in this village over 6 weeks, always in proximity to one household, always between the hours of 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning, always drawn with what I believe to be dressmaker's chalk, rather than the common variety, which suggests a person of domestic occupation, or at minimum one familiar with needlework supplies. He set the letter down. She then provides 3 further observations, each of which is independently verifiable, and a deduction about emotional motive that I find, he paused, in the way of a man selecting a word carefully, compelling. Watson put down the newspaper. What sort of deduction? That this is not a threat, that it is a long-held grievance, expressing itself in a form that requires being seen without requiring confrontation. Holmes picked up the Lestrade note and the Mayfair report, and held them beside the letter. The same figures, Watson. The same right-hand raised posture, the same chalk, the same placement at knee-height on a stone surface. St. Mary Mead, Bloomsbury, and Mayfair. 3 locations, 1 pattern. He set all 3 papers down and stood back and looked at them the way he looked at crime scenes, not moving, not touching, just observing, letting the arrangement speak. "It's a cipher," he said. "The figures are an alphabet, and someone is writing in it across a considerable geographic distance. The morning outside Baker Street was doing its best impression of November, which September occasionally attempted in London when it was feeling ambitious. The sky was the colour of old pewter, and the street below was wet from a rain that had passed through before dawn, and left the cobblestones dark and reflective, so that the passing cabs and their horses appeared doubled, each vehicle accompanied by its own inverted shadow moving through a liquid London below the real one. Mrs. Hudson brought tea at 9:30, and Holmes drank his standing up, which he did when his mind was moving faster than his body wanted to keep still. Watson watched him, and ate toast, and waited, because the thinking while standing phase generally preceded the talking phase, and interrupting it accomplished nothing except making Holmes lose the thread and become briefly irritable. The sitting-room had its usual morning character. The fire built up well against the grey day, the smell of coal smoke and cold tea, and the faint chemical tang of whatever Holmes had been doing with the specimens on the side table the previous evening. A copy of The Strand open on the desk, a violin bow resting on the sofa, in a manner that suggested it had been used recently, and at some length, possibly at an hour that had not been considerate to the neighbourhood. Holmes set down his tea and picked up the 3 papers again and held them fanned in one hand like a peculiar set of cards, and looked at them for a moment with his eyes slightly narrowed. "The boarding-house in Bloomsbury," he said. The figure was found on the external wall adjacent to the front door. Lestrade's note says a former resident had recently vacated the premises. A young woman, quiet, occupation listed in the register as seamstress, gave 3 weeks' notice and left without incident. A seamstress, Watson said, which would explain the dressmaker's chalk. Precisely. The Mayfair service entrance is used by tradespeople. A seamstress delivering work, or collecting it, would have entirely legitimate reason to be in that alley. Holmes set the papers down and picked up his coat from the back of the chair where it had been draped. The figures are not random placements. Each location connects to a specific person or household. The question is what the cipher says, and to whom. Watson looked at the letter from St. Mary Mead. And the letter, she mentions a name, E.F., 1903. Elena Fenn, Holmes said, without hesitation, which meant he had already worked through the initials. The ribbon placed at the churchyard, a prize ribbon from a parish fete, kept for 30 years, and placed deliberately. He paused. Someone who keeps a thing for 30 years and then places it has decided that the keeping is finished, that the time for the other thing has come. He looked at Watson. "We are going to St. Mary Mead." The train left Paddington at 11:30. They had a carriage to themselves for most of the journey, which suited Holmes, who spread his papers across the opposite seat, and worked in silence, while Watson watched the city dissolve gradually into the quieter geography of the home counties, the terraces giving way to semi-detached houses, the semi-detached houses giving way to fields, the fields becoming the long, rolling, unhurried English countryside in its September colours, the greens deepening toward autumn, the hedgerows thick and dark, occasional clusters of farm buildings sitting low in the landscape, as though they had grown there rather than been built. Holmes had taken out a notebook and was transcribing the stick figures from Lestrade's sketches, crude copies, but adequate, and laying them in rows, the way you lay out the pieces of an alphabet when you are trying to find the system beneath them. He worked with a pencil, adding small notations beside each figure. The position of the arms, the angle of the legs, the specific arrangement of the raised hand. Watson, watching from across the carriage, could see the moment it began to resolve for him, a slight change in the quality of his stillness. The pencil slowing, then stopping, then marking something with a small, firm circle. Substitution cipher, Holmes said, mostly to himself. Simple in structure. Each figure represents a letter, the variation in arm and leg position indicating which letter. 19 distinct figures in the combined samples. Insufficient for a full alphabet, but adequate for a message using common letters. What does it say? Holmes looked at his notebook. I have 12 letters, identified with confidence. The message is incomplete. I need more figures to complete it. But I have the first word. He held up the notebook. Watson looked. Remember. Watson was quiet for a moment, watching the fields go by. Not a threat, he said. No, Miss Marple was right. Not a threat. Holmes set the notebook down on the seat beside him and looked out the window at the English countryside doing its patient September things, at the sky clearing slowly from the west, at the shadows of clouds moving across the hillsides below. An insistence, he said after a moment, which is a different thing entirely. The station at St. Mary Mead was small and well kept, with hanging baskets that had been magnificent in July and were now, in the dignified decline of early autumn, still presentable, but aware that their moment had passed. A porter moved a luggage trolley along the platform with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has moved luggage along this platform for many years and has reached an accommodation with the pace of it. On the platform, near the gate, stood a small, upright figure in a grey coat, with white hair beneath a sensible hat, and an umbrella hooked over one arm, despite the fact that the rain had cleared. She was watching the train arrive with the expression of a person who has been doing something useful while waiting, and has now smoothly redirected their attention. Holmes stepped down from the carriage and stopped. Watson, behind him, recognized the quality of the pause. It was the pause Holmes made when he was observing, rapidly, in the first seconds of encountering someone new. He was looking at Miss Marple the way he looked at a crime scene, taking in the details before the moment rearranged itself. Miss Marple, for her part, was looking at Holmes with the same quality of attention, which Watson found quietly amusing. Holmes said, "Miss Marple," she said. "Mr. Holmes, I hope the journey was comfortable." She looked at Watson with a warm, direct smile. "And you must be Dr. Watson. I have read your accounts with great interest. You have a gift for the telling detail." Watson said that was very kind, and meant it, because she said it in the manner of a person making an accurate observation rather than paying a compliment. Holmes said, "Your letter was excellent." Miss Marple said, "Your coming was prompt." There was something almost like amusement in it. "I had hoped you would come, but I wasn't entirely certain. Some people read my letters and decide I am a fanciful old woman." "Some people," Holmes said, picking up his bag, "are inattentive." He looked at her. "You identified the dressmaker's chalk, the emotional pattern, and the name. That is 3/4 of the case. I have the cipher structure. Together we may have the whole of it." Miss Marple nodded once, the nod of a woman who considers this a satisfactory state of affairs. "Then come along," she said, turning toward the gate. I have the kettle on, and there's quite a lot to tell you about the parish fete of 1903. Miss Marple's sitting room was the kind of room that took you in. Not grandly. There was nothing grand about it. It was small and warm, and slightly crowded in the manner of rooms that have been lived in attentively for many years, where things accumulate not through carelessness, but through the slow deposit of a life that has found most of its objects worth keeping. There were books on every surface, not displayed, but used, with the cracked spines and occasional slips of paper that indicated genuine reading rather than decoration. There were plants on the windowsill, a begonia, an aspidistra, something trailing that Watson couldn't name, tended with the same quiet regularity as everything else in Miss Marple's orbit. There was a basket of knitting on the footstool. There was a small fire, modest and steady, and above it a clock that ticked with the particular soft authority of a clock that has been ticking in the same spot for a very long time, and sees no reason to change its habits. The tea was already poured when they sat down. This alone told Watson something, not just that she had been expecting them, but that she had been expecting them at the precise time they arrived, which meant she had calculated the train connections and the time from the station and had put the kettle on accordingly. It was, in its way, as precise a piece of timing as anything Holmes managed. Holmes sat in the chair opposite Miss Marple and accepted his tea, and said nothing for a moment, looking at the room with his usual comprehensive attention. Watson took the small armchair to the side, which placed him slightly outside the main conversation, in the way he preferred, close enough to observe both of them, far enough not to interrupt the dynamic that was already quietly establishing itself. It was the dynamic of two people who do the same kind of work by entirely different methods, meeting for the first time and attempting, with considerable mutual politeness, to establish what the other actually knows. The cipher, Holmes said, setting down his cup, is a simple alphabet substitution. Each stick figure represents a letter by the position of the arms and legs. I have reconstructed 19 letters from the available samples. The message, as best I can determine it from the incomplete figures, begins with the word remember, and contains at minimum 2 proper nouns that I have not yet fully decoded. Miss Marple listened to this with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on Holmes, with an expression of focused, comfortable attention. "The proper nouns," she said, "will be names. Almost certainly. The names will be in the Parish Charitable Fund ledger," she said, "which is kept at the church. The ledger from 1902 to 1908, specifically. The year 1903 is the relevant one. That was the year of the fete at which the incident occurred." She paused. "I should say, the incident that the person responsible for these drawings has been carrying for 30 years. Holmes looked at her. "You know what the incident was?" "I believe I do. Not the full details. Those, I suspect, are in the ledger, and in the account of whoever was present. But the shape of it." She looked down at her hands briefly, then back up. "A young woman named Elena was staying with her aunt in the village that summer. She was 17, I think, or perhaps 18, very young, and not from a family of any local standing, which, in a village like this one, matters rather more than it ought. She entered the parish fete's needlework competition. Her embroidery was Miss Marple paused, with the expression of someone choosing precision over approximation, quite exceptionally good, better than anything else entered that year, and better, frankly, than anything that had been entered in several years. Watson was watching her. Holmes had become very still, which was his listening posture. "She did not win," Miss Marple said. "The prize went to a Mrs. Hargreaves, who was at that time a Mrs. Cavell, recently married, newly arrived in the village. Her work was competent. It was not better than Elena Fenn's." She said this without particular heat, simply as a statement of established fact. The judging committee was composed of 3 women, 2 of whom were closely connected to the Hargreaves family through the golf club. The decision was not close. Afterward, a rumour circulated. It was never traced to a specific source, but it circulated thoroughly, that Elena Fenn had copied her design from a London pattern book rather than producing it herself. The rumour was untrue, but it attached to her, as untrue things do when they are given enough air, and she left the village before Christmas. Her aunt moved away the following spring. The room was quiet for a moment, the fire settling softly, the clock continuing its patient count. "And the ribbon," Watson said. "Elena Fenn's ribbon," Miss Marple confirmed. "First prize. She should have had it. She kept it, or kept something that represented it, for 30 years. And now she's placed it at the churchyard gate, next to the wall where she drew her figures." She looked at Holmes. "That is not the action of a person planning harm. That is the action of a person who has decided that the record should be corrected." Holmes said, "The ledger." "The ledger will show the charitable fund contributions from that year. The Hargreaves family, Cavell, at the time, made a substantial donation to the fund committee, the same committee that judged the needlework." Miss Marple said this quietly, with no particular emphasis. She did not need to add more. The shape of what had happened was clear enough. Holmes picked up his notebook and looked at the incomplete cipher. "The names in the message," he said slowly, "are not threats. They are a list. A list of witnesses," Miss Marple said. "People who were present and who said nothing, or who passed the rumour along. She is naming them. Not publicly. The cipher ensures no one else can read it unless they know the alphabet. But she knows she is naming them, and she wants them to know, if they find the drawings and are intelligent enough to read them, that she has named them." She looked at Holmes with something that was quietly direct. "It is a private reckoning. It was never meant to be a public one." Holmes was quiet for longer than usual after this. He set the notebook down on the arm of the chair and looked at the fire, and Watson recognized the quality of this particular silence. It was not the silence of a man computing, but of a man reconsidering, adjusting the angle from which he had approached something. "The London figures," he said at last, "Bloomsbury and Mayfair. If the message is private, intended for the people named in it, why write it in London as well as in the village? Because 2 of the people named in it no longer live in the village," Miss Marple said. "The Hargreaves family has connections in Mayfair. Mrs. Hargreaves has a sister there, I believe, whose husband is connected to the club where the figures appeared at the service entrance, and the Bloomsbury boarding house. I was not certain of this connection until your letter confirmed the former resident was a seamstress. That is Elena's trade, and it is Elena's boarding house, which means she has been living in Bloomsbury for some time. The figure on the boarding house wall is not addressed outward. It is addressed inward. It is, I think," She paused again. Her own record of where she lived when she finally did this. A notation. I was here when I decided. Watson felt the particular weight of this settle in the room. Outside, the September afternoon was doing its mild and golden things. The light through the sitting-room windows had the long, slanted quality of mid-afternoon, warm on the carpet, catching the dust motes above the begonia on the sill. Holmes said, after a moment, "You understand motive differently than I do." It was not a criticism. Watson could tell from the way he said it, direct, without any of the performative edges he sometimes used, that it was a genuine observation. Miss Marple said, "You understand structure. I understand people. They are both necessary." "They are," Holmes said. He looked at her with an expression that Watson found difficult to characterize precisely, because he did not see it often. It was something like respect delivered without qualification, without the slight reservation Holmes generally maintained as a kind of intellectual insurance. "The ledger," he said. "I should like to see it." "I thought you might. I spoke to the vicar yesterday, and he has agreed to make it available this afternoon." She glanced at the clock. "We have perhaps 40 minutes before he expects us." She picked up her knitting from the footstool, with the air of a woman who does not believe in wasting 40 minutes. Watson looked at the window, at the village going about its afternoon, and thought about Elena Fenn, 17 years old, at a summer fete, her embroidery the best in the room, the ribbon going elsewhere, the rumour following her out of the village like a shadow she couldn't put down. Carrying it for 30 years. Not in bitterness, he thought, or not only in bitterness. In the precise, patient way of someone who is waiting for the moment when the record can be set straight, even if only in chalk on a stone wall, even if only in a cipher that almost no one can read. Remember, he understood why she had chosen that word. It was not addressed to the village. It was addressed to herself. The ledger was a large, cloth-bound volume, dark green, going brown at the corners, with the years stamped in faded gold on the spine. The vicar, a mild man named Fellows, who had the permanently slightly apologetic air of a person who has spent many years navigating other people's disputes, produced it from the vestry, with the careful handling of someone delivering something that he suspected was going to prove inconvenient. Holmes opened it at 1903 and ran his finger down the columns without touching the ink, an old habit, Watson knew, the preservation instinct, and found what he was looking for in approximately 90 seconds. He read it once. Then he looked at Miss Marple. She was watching him with her hands folded. 3 donations, Holmes said quietly, all made within 2 weeks of the fete, all from families connected to the judging committee. He looked back at the ledger, and here he pointed without touching. A notation in a different hand, smaller, added later, 2 initials and a cross. He looked up. Someone else knew, someone on the committee, or close to it, and they recorded it. Not publicly, just recorded it. Because they couldn't say it, Miss Marple said, but they couldn't not say it either. So they wrote it in the ledger, where it would be found eventually, by someone who was looking. Holmes closed the ledger gently and stood back, and the 3 of them stood in the quiet vestry, with the smell of old paper and candle wax, and the faint, cool, particular smell of churches that are very old, and the afternoon light coming through the small high window in a long pale bar across the stone floor. "Well," Holmes said, after a moment. Yes, Miss Marple said. Watson thought that between two such people, that was probably sufficient. Watson went back to London on the Thursday morning train. This had been Holmes's suggestion, delivered the previous evening over supper at the village inn, a quiet place with low beams and a fire that had clearly been burning in that particular grate since approximately the reign of Elizabeth I, and a landlord who produced a very adequate lamb chop and asked no questions, which Holmes considered the ideal combination in a public house. The suggestion was characteristically efficient. Watson knew London. Watson knew how to talk to landladies and delivery men, and the kind of people who work in the back rooms of clubs without making them feel interrogated. And Watson had, Holmes said this plainly, without framing it as a compliment, which somehow made it more of one. A face that people trusted. Watson had accepted this without comment, finished his lamb chop, and gone to bed in the inn's small upper room, listening to the village do its quiet, night-time things. An owl somewhere, the distant sound of the church clock marking the hours, the absolute, specific, slightly astonishing silence that a village produces at 2 in the morning when you are accustomed to London. He took the 9:15 from St. Mary Mead Station in a thin autumn mist, with Miss Marple's notes copied into his own notebook, and Holmes's partial cipher transcription folded into his breast pocket, and he watched the countryside reverse its previous journey, fields becoming houses, houses becoming terraces, the sky lowering and the air thickening as London announced itself first, through smell, and then through sound, and then through the particular quality of grey that is London's own grey, different from the grey of anywhere else, denser and more particular, the grey of a city that generates its own weather through the sheer accumulated effort of several million people going about their business simultaneously. By 11 o'clock he was in Bloomsbury. The boarding house on Montague Street was a narrow Georgian terrace of the kind that Bloomsbury produces in abundance. 4 stories, a black door with a brass knocker that had been polished recently but not frequently, window boxes that had given up somewhere around August and had not been encouraged since. A discreet card in the lower window said, "Rooms, respectable persons only," which Watson had always found a mildly optimistic claim for a boarding house to make, but which, in this case, appeared to be borne out by the general tidiness of the front steps and the quality of the curtains. The landlady was a Mrs. Coleman, a small, precise woman in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the manner of someone who has been managing other people's domestic arrangements for a very long time, and has developed a comprehensive, unsentimental intelligence about human behaviour as a result. She received Watson's card, noted the doctor, and invited him in with the specific warmth that landladies extend to doctors, who represent both respectability and the useful possibility of a professional opinion on the recurring damp in the back bedroom. He told her he was making inquiries about a former resident, a Miss Elena Fenn, on behalf of a family matter. This was close enough to true not to trouble him unduly. Mrs. Coleman made tea and considered the matter. Elena Fenn had lived in the second-floor front room for 3 years. She was quiet. She was punctual with her rent, which Mrs. Coleman considered the primary civic virtue. She worked from her room mostly, sewing work, alterations, and fine needlework, the kind that comes by recommendation rather than advertisement. She had her clients bring things to the house, or she collected them, and she delivered them herself. She did not keep late hours. She did not have visitors who caused concern. She had left 3 weeks ago, giving the required notice and departing on a Tuesday with 2 cases and a large flat parcel tied in brown paper and string in the manner of someone transporting a framed picture. Did she seem— Watson chose the word carefully— settled in the time before she left? Or was there anything different about her? Mrs. Coleman thought about this with the genuine consideration of a woman who has observed people carefully for many years. She was always contained, she said. Private, you'd say, but not unfriendly. In the last few months, she paused. Purposeful. That's the word. She had the manner of someone who had decided something and was getting on with it. Watson wrote purposeful in his notebook. Did she leave anything behind? Mrs. Coleman set down her teacup. A few things she said she didn't need. I've kept them in case of forwarding, though she left no address. She looked at Watson with the direct appraising quality of someone deciding how much to trust. She left a picture, she said. I thought it an odd thing to leave, but she said quite specifically that I could keep it or give it away, or dispose of it as I liked. I've kept it because it seemed— she paused again— personal. The picture was in a frame that had been made, Watson thought, by someone who knew what they were doing with wood and a mitre joint. It hung on the wall of the small back sitting room that Mrs. Coleman used for her own purposes, placed there apparently because she had not been able to bring herself to put it in the box room. It was a child's drawing. Or rather, and this was the thing that stopped Watson in front of it for longer than he had expected, it was a drawing that looked like a child's drawing, but was not. The stick figures that filled the page, 20 or 30 of them, a whole crowd, arranged in rows like a school photograph, were drawn with the same care and precision as the chalk figures on the village walls, the same deliberate placement of arms, the same specific angles, each figure slightly different from its neighbour. Each figure, Watson realized slowly, representing a letter. It was the cipher. The whole cipher, or the better part of it, arranged as a picture, framed and hung on a wall. Not a threat, not a message to be decoded by Scotland Yard. A piece of art that only meant something if you already knew what it meant. A private document dressed as a decoration. Watson stood before it for a long time. He thought about Eleanor Fenn making this, sitting at the table in the second-floor front room, the needlework set aside for once, the pen moving carefully across the paper, making her alphabet of figures. Making it because she needed to see it whole, perhaps. Because the act of making it was part of whatever this was. He asked Mrs. Coleman if he could make a copy of it. She said she supposed that would be all right. He spent 20 minutes with his notebook, transcribing each figure carefully, grateful for Holmes's notation system, which gave him a vocabulary for what he was seeing. When he was done, he had 41 distinct figures, 11 more than Holmes had recovered from the wall samples. The message, he thought, could probably be completed now. He thanked Mrs. Coleman, refused a second cup of tea, and went back out into the Bloomsbury morning. The Mayfair end took him the better part of the afternoon. The club was in Curzon Street, one of the older ones, the kind with a door that communicates members only without requiring a sign, through sheer quality of brass fittings and the expression of the man who opens it. Watson was not a member. He went instead to the service entrance in the alley behind, where deliveries were received by a young man named Perkins, who had a ledger of his own, considerably less historically significant than the one at St. Mary Mead Church, recording the names and purposes of every tradesperson who came to the back door. Watson explained himself as an inquiry agent, accurate, if reductive, and asked about the chalk drawings on the wall. Perkins had noticed them on a Monday morning 3 weeks ago. 2 figures on the brick beside the service door, drawn at knee-height, faded by the following day's rain. He had thought nothing particular of them until his superior had mentioned that similar drawings had been found on a wall in Bloomsbury, at which point it had seemed worth noting. He could not say who had drawn them. The alley was used by tradespeople from early morning, and deliveries arrived sometimes before 6. Watson asked about regular tradespeople. Perkins consulted his ledger. The club used a dressmaker for staff uniforms and occasional alterations to members' property. A Miss Fenn, who had been coming to the service entrance every second Wednesday for approximately 2.5 years. She had not come for the past month. Was she well regarded? Watson asked. Very, Perkins said, with the plain directness of someone who values competence above social category. Never late, never incorrect, very fine work. The housekeeper was sorry to lose her. Did she know anyone connected to the club? As members, I mean, rather than staff? Perkins considered. She mentioned once, I don't know why I remember this. It was a small thing. She mentioned that she'd grown up near a family whose name I recognized from the membership list. Hargreaves. She said it in the way people say something they've been carrying for a while, and have decided it doesn't matter whether they say or not. Watson wrote this down. He stood in the Mayfair alley for a moment after Perkins had gone back inside, looking at the brick wall where the figures had been. The chalk was long gone, but he looked at the place anyway, knee-height, the right spot of smooth brick, just as it had been described. He thought about Elena Fenn standing here on a Wednesday morning with her parcel of alterations under one arm, drawing her 2 small figures on the wall of the club, where a woman connected to her mother's old humiliation was a member's sister. Not rage, not vandalism. A notation. I was here. I remember. You should, too. Elena Fenn's cottage was at the end of a lane that the village appeared to have forgotten about. This was not unusual in St. Mary Mead, which had accumulated its geography over several centuries without any particular plan, and which contained a number of such lanes, narrow, hedged, leading off the main roads at angles that suggested they had originally been made by someone taking the most convenient path between 2 points, and everyone else simply following the same line until it became permanent. This particular lane ran along the eastern edge of the village, past a field that had been left to its own devices for the better part of a decade, and had responded to this freedom by becoming very thoroughly itself. Long grass, bramble, a stand of elder that had expanded to occupy whatever territory was available, and ended at a small stone cottage that had been rented, according to the inquiries Miss Marple had made through the precise and comprehensive intelligence network that she did not refer to as an intelligence network, but which functioned as one for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The same span as the chalk drawings. Holmes noted this without saying it, because he had already said it in the train carriage from London the previous evening when Watson's letter arrived, and they had sat with it spread between them and the English autumn dark, going past the windows, and talked through what it meant. Watson had joined them that morning on the first train from Paddington, arriving at the inn with his notebook and his copied cipher, and the particular expression of a man who has spent 2 days following a trail and has arrived at a destination he is not entirely certain he is glad to have reached. Miss Marple had been ready at 9:30 with a coat and umbrella, and the composed, unhurried manner of a woman who has been preparing for this conversation in her mind for some time, and is moderately confident she knows how it needs to go. They walked rather than taking the constable's car. Holmes had been clear about this, in the way he was occasionally clear about procedural matters when the procedure was actually about atmosphere, about arriving as people, rather than as an investigation, about giving Elena Fenn the opportunity to make a choice, rather than simply finding herself caught. Miss Marple had agreed immediately. Constable Draper, who had been included in the party with some reluctance on Holmes's part, and considerable reluctance on his own, had agreed less immediately, but had come around. The morning was still, with a low white mist, sitting in the hollows of the fields, and the hedgerows carrying their last autumn colour, the dark red of hawthorn berries, the yellow of field maple, the occasional fierce orange of a late turning branch. Their footsteps on the lane were quiet on the packed earth, and the only sounds were the distant machinery of a farm, somewhere to the north, and the close, specific sounds of the hedge, a robin, persistent and territorial, and the small rustling of something making its way through the lower growth with the focused efficiency of a creature with things to do. Holmes walked ahead slightly, as he usually did. Miss Marple walked beside Watson, and she said quietly, without particular preamble, "She will be there." "You're certain?" "She has not run. She has been here for 6 weeks, and she has made no effort to conceal herself. She gave her name when she rented the cottage. She has been into the village twice. She was seen at the post office last Thursday. She is not hiding. She is waiting." Miss Marple adjusted her umbrella on her arm. People who have been waiting a very long time for something to resolve develop a particular quality of patience. She has done what she came to do. Now she is waiting to see what happens next. Watson thought about this. Is she afraid, do you think? Miss Marple considered it with genuine care. "I think she's tired," she said after a moment. "Which is different. Afraid suggests she believes something bad is coming. Tired suggests she has been carrying something heavy and has recently put it down and has not yet decided how to feel about being without it." The cottage door was answered before they knocked. This was the first thing Watson noticed. They had come through the small gate and up the path between 2 beds of late-season flowers. Someone had planted these recently, the soil still dark and new around the stems, which Watson found unexpectedly affecting. And Holmes had raised his hand to knock, and the door opened. Elena Fenn was perhaps 50 years old. This required a small internal adjustment, because Watson had been carrying in his mind the image of a 17-year-old girl at a parish fete, and the woman in the doorway was not that. Was someone who had lived the intervening 33 years in the visible way that lives are lived, in the lines around the eyes, and the set of the mouth, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned, through long practice, not to waste energy on motion that serves no purpose. She was slight and neatly dressed, and she looked at the four of them in the doorway with an expression that was not afraid, and was not defiant, and was not, Watson thought, surprised. She looked at Miss Marple first. "I thought it would be you," she said. "I've seen you in the village." Miss Marple said, "Good morning, Miss Fenn. I am sorry to come unannounced. May we come in?" A pause. Then Elena Fenn stepped back from the door and held it open. The cottage inside was spare and clean, with the temporary quality of a place that has been made comfortable, but not quite made home. Things arranged with care, but without the accretion of genuine habitation. A table, 4 chairs, a small fire. On the table, a piece of needlework in a frame, mid-progress, the needle still in the fabric. The walls were bare, except for one thing, a small, framed piece, paper rather than canvas, hung beside the window where the light was good. Holmes looked at it immediately, and Watson looked at Holmes. It was a version of the cipher picture, not the one Mrs. Coleman had described, smaller, simpler, fewer figures, a subset of the alphabet. In the centre, larger than the surrounding figures, one single stick figure with its right hand raised. Eleanor Fenn sat down at the table without being asked, in the manner of someone on familiar ground, and looked at her hands. She did not offer tea, which Watson noted. Not from inhospitality, he thought, but because the usual social forms had been quietly set aside, and she knew it, and they knew it, and proceeding as though they hadn't would have been a kind of insult to the occasion. Holmes sat down across from her, and Constable Draper remained near the door, his notebook out but not open, with the expression of a man doing his best to follow events that are moving faster than his training prepared him for. Miss Marple sat beside the table, not across it. This was deliberate, Watson thought. Not the geometry of interrogation, but of accompaniment. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Eleanor Fenn with the direct, unfrightening attention she gave to everyone, the attention that said, "I am listening, and I will not look away, but I am not here to judge you." It was Holmes who spoke first. "The cipher is elegant," he said, "simple in structure, but sufficient for your purpose. I decoded the greater part of it from the wall samples. Dr. Watson's visit to your former lodgings provided the remainder." Elena Fenn looked at him. "You decoded it." "Yes." A silence. Then quietly, "Did she? Mrs. Hargreaves?" "I don't believe so," Holmes said. "She recognized the figures as intentional. She was disturbed by them. But she did not, as far as we have been able to determine, decode the alphabet." Something moved in Elena Fenn's expression. Not quite relief, not quite disappointment. Something between them, the specific emotion of a person who has prepared for 2 possible outcomes and finds the actual outcome is a third thing that sits between both. "What does the message say?" Watson asked gently. She looked at him for a moment, then at the framed picture on the wall. "It says, 'Remember the name Eleanor Fenn. She told the truth. You did not.'" She said it without drama, in the quiet reciting tone of something learned by heart. "And then, it says the names of the 3 women on the judging committee that year. And then, it says, the embroidery was hers, the ribbon was not." The fire shifted softly. Outside, a wood pigeon made its 3-note call, and then fell silent. Miss Marple said, "Your mother." Eleanor looked at her. "Eleanor, not Eleanor. Your mother's name was Eleanor." Miss Marple said it gently but plainly. "You took a version of it." A long pause. Then Eleanor said, "She died in 1931. She She was never restored. Nobody ever said that. It hadn't happened the way they said it happened. Not publicly. Not so that it would matter. She looked at the table. She didn't make a fuss about it. That was her way. She packed up, and she left, and she didn't make a fuss. Because making a fuss was not what women like her did. And because she knew that if she made a fuss, the fuss would become the story, and the original thing would be buried under it. A pause. She was right about that. She was right about most things. Holmes was watching her with the quality of attention he brought to witnesses who were telling the truth. Not analytical now, simply present. "I trained as a seamstress," Elena said, "because she had been one. Because it was the thing she was good at before it was taken from her. The reputation for good work, the people who came to her because they trusted her hand. I became what she had been. And I got very good at it. And I thought, for a long time, I thought that was enough. That I would just be good at it, and that would be a kind of answer. But it wasn't," Watson said. "It wasn't an answer to anything," she said, without bitterness. It was just my life, which was a good life. I want to be clear that I am not describing myself as a person who has suffered terribly. I had a good life. But there was this thing, this one thing that was wrong and had never been made right. And as she got older, and then as she died, I thought about it more rather than less." Miss Marple said, "The chalk figures were not addressed to Mrs. Hargreaves." Elena looked at her. They were placed near her house, and near things connected to her. But the cipher, the message, is not addressed to her. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "It is addressed to the record, to whoever might one day read it and know." A long silence. "Yes," Elena said finally, quietly. "That is, yes." Holmes reached into his jacket pocket and placed on the table the folded letter, the one that had arrived at Baker Street with the broken seal. He smoothed it flat with one hand and turned it so Elena could see. "This letter was tampered with before it reached me," he said. "The seal was broken and resealed. Someone read it before I did and chose not to act on it. Do you know who sent it?" Elena looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she said, "The vicar, Mr. Fellows." Watson thought of the mild, slightly apologetic man who had produced the ledger from the vestry. He knew, Elena said. He found the notation in the ledger, the two initials and the cross, in the different handwriting. He found it years ago, he told me. He wrote to me in London last spring, through my aunt's old address, which was forwarded. She looked at the letter. He said he could not undo what had been done, but that the ledger existed, and that there was a record, and that he thought I should know. A pause. "I think he read your letter because he wanted to know if it was going to go badly for me. And when he saw what it was, when he understood that you were coming to investigate and not to arrest, he let it go forward." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He kept the notation in the ledger all these years." "He said he couldn't bring himself to remove it," Elena said. "He said a record is a record, even if no one reads it for 100 years. The resolution, when it came, was not dramatic. These things rarely were, Miss Marple reflected. The dramatic resolutions existed in sensation novels and in the popular imagination of what detection involved, but the real ones were almost always quiet, conducted in small rooms with tea going cold on the table, and they required no handcuffs and no courtroom, only the specific courage of acknowledgement. Holmes looked at Constable Draper. "No crime has been committed," he said, clearly and finally. "Chalk on a public wall is not criminal damage. A ribbon left at a churchyard gate is not trespassing. A cipher drawn on a boarding-house wall by its own former resident is not vandalism." He looked at Elena. "There is nothing here for the law to act upon." Constable Draper, who had privately reached the same conclusion some time ago, and was relieved to have it stated by someone whose opinion would carry weight, closed his notebook with the expression of a man who is quietly pleased with how a thing has turned out. Miss Marple said, "There remains the question of Mrs. Hargreaves." Everyone in the room understood what she meant by this. Not confrontation, not accusation, not public exposure, nothing that would require Mrs. Hargreaves to make a fuss or defend herself. Something smaller and more difficult. The private acknowledgement that the wrong thing had been done, and that the person it had been done to had a name, and that the name was Eleanor Fenn, and that the embroidery had been hers. Elena looked at the table for a long time. Then she said, "I don't need an apology. I don't expect one." A pause. But if it could be said, once by someone, that my mother's work was good, that it was the best work there that day, that is the thing that was taken, not the ribbon, the acknowledgement. Miss Marple looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at Miss Marple. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that I can arrange for that to be said." The rain came in the night and was gone by morning. It was the proper autumn rain this time, not September's tentative, apologetic version, but October's more settled and deliberate kind, the rain that means business, that comes in off the west in long grey curtains and works its way through the village with the thorough, unhurried efficiency of something that has a job to do, and intends to do it properly. It rained from midnight until 4, and by the time the sky began its slow, uncertain brightening over the eastern fields, the lane outside the inn was dark and gleaming. The hedgerows were hung with water. The marigolds in the cottage gardens had been relieved of their last dead heads, and the air had the particular clean, washed quality that only exists in the hour after the autumn rain, cold and bright and smelling of earth and wet stone and something indefinably beginning again. Watson stood at the inn window with his morning tea and watched the village surface into the day. He had slept well, which surprised him, given that the previous afternoon had contained the kind of conversation that generally lodges in the mind and turns over at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet. But he had gone to bed with the particular stillness of a person who has seen something resolve, not perfectly, not entirely, but in the right direction, which was as much as most things managed, and he had slept the untroubled sleep of a man whose conscience has been given very little to work with. He thought about Eleanor Fenn in her borrowed cottage at the end of the forgotten lane, and whether she had slept. He thought she probably had. The quality of tiredness that Miss Marple had identified, the tiredness of having put something down, was not the kind that keeps a person awake. It was the kind that finally allows them to rest. Holmes was already at the small table in the inn's breakfast room when Watson came down, with a cup of coffee and his notebook open, though he was not writing in it. He was looking out the window at the wet lane with the expression he wore when his mind had largely finished with something and was moving on in a quiet, unhurried way to whatever came next. Watson sat down and ordered eggs and looked at the notebook. The cipher was there, completed now. All 41 figures, translated into their letters. The message written out in full in Holmes' small, precise hand. Remember the name Eleanor Fenn. She told the truth. You did not. The embroidery was hers. The ribbon was not. And then 5 names, neatly listed. Watson looked at it for a moment, then at Holmes. What will you do with it? Nothing, Holmes said. It is not mine to do anything with. He closed the notebook. The message was not addressed to me. Watson nodded. Outside, a cart went up the lane with a slow, comfortable sound of iron on wet stone, and the driver exchanged a word with someone at a garden gate in the easy, unhurried way of people who have been exchanging words at that gate for 20 years and expect to do so for 20 more. She was right, you know, Watson said after a moment. Miss Marple, about the motive. She was entirely right, Holmes said, without qualification. I had approached it as a cipher problem because it presented as a cipher problem. She approached it as a human problem because she recognized it as one. The cipher was the form. The grief was the content. He drank his coffee. I should have seen that earlier. The cipher is always the smaller thing. Watson thought this was probably one of the more significant things Holmes had said in his hearing, and that Holmes knew it, and that neither of them was going to make anything of it, which was the correct response. Miss Marple arrived at 9:30. She came through the inn door in her grey coat with her umbrella, unnecessary now, the rain long gone, but carried anyway on the principle that October was not to be trusted. And she sat down and accepted tea from the landlady with the specific warmth she brought to every ordinary transaction, the quality of genuine attention that made people feel that their small services had been properly received, which they had. She had been to see Mrs. Hargreaves that morning, early, before 8, before the village was fully awake, before the day had acquired its social traffic. She told them about it simply, without dramatizing it, because it was not a dramatic thing, and dressing it up as one would have diminished it. She had knocked at Linden House and been admitted, and had sat with Mrs. Hargreaves in the morning room, which was a rather cold room, that Watson had the impression was rarely used, and she had said what needed to be said. She had said it plainly, without accusation, and without softening it, into something that could be absorbed without acknowledgement. She had said that Eleanor Fenn's embroidery had been the finest work at the 1903 Parish fete, and that the judging had not been conducted fairly, and that this had been known at the time by more than one person, and that it was time for it to be said plainly, once, by someone who had been there. Mrs. Hargreaves had not said anything for a long time. Then she had said, "I knew." Not defensively, not as a confession, exactly, simply as a fact that she had been carrying in the same way that Eleanor had been carrying hers. Not with identical weight, not with identical feeling, but carrying nonetheless, in the specific, uncomfortable way of people who have done a wrong thing, and have never been required to say so, and have therefore never been released from it. She said that she had thought, at the time, that it was a small thing, Miss Marple told them, looking at her teacup, that it was a parish fete, and a ribbon, and a girl she didn't know. She said she had thought that, and had continued to think it for a number of years, and that at some point she had stopped being able to think it, but that the moment for saying anything had long since passed, and so she had simply carried it. Watson thought about the key in the lock, about Mrs. Hargreaves's face on the front step, seeing the chalk figure, not the face of a woman encountering a prank, the face of a woman who had been waiting, on some level, for exactly this. "What did she say?" Holmes asked. "In the end." "She said that Eleanor Fenn's embroidery was very fine work," Miss Marple said, "and that the prize should have gone to her." She paused. She said it clearly and in full. I told her that I would ensure the record reflected it. She looked at Holmes. "The vicar has agreed to add a note to the ledger, a formal note, properly dated, stating the correction. It will not undo anything, but it will be there." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is what Elena wanted. It is what both of them needed," Miss Marple said, "which is sometimes the same thing, and sometimes not. In this case, I think, the same." They walked through the village before the London train, the three of them together at Miss Marple's suggestion, because she said it was a good morning for it, and because Watson suspected she wanted the village to see Holmes and Watson departing in good order, without the visual vocabulary of an arrest or an ongoing investigation, wanted the case to close quietly, as the best cases did, without leaving a visible mark. The village in the aftermath of rain was very fine. The high street had the polished temporary brightness that wet mornings produce, every surface reflecting the pale October sky, the puddles in the lane running in slow threads toward the drain at the corner. The shops were opening, the draper's, the post office, the small greengrocer's, where a display of apples was being arranged in the doorway with considerable care. Mrs. Brent was visible through the post office window, opening the day's mail with the attentive efficiency of a woman taking up a duty she considers important. Holmes walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the street, in the observational mode he inhabited in any new environment, and Watson watched him noting things, the quality of the brickwork, the arrangement of the houses, the way the village's geography expressed its history. Holmes had a genuine appreciation for the specific character of places when he allowed himself to show it. Miss Marple walked between them at a pace that was comfortable and unhurried, pointing out things occasionally. The elm in the churchyard that was older than the church itself, the corner where the forge had been before it became the garage, the particular house where 3 generations of the same family had lived, and where the 4th generation had recently arrived in the form of a new baby who could be heard at certain hours exercising his opinions from the upstairs window. At the churchyard gate they stopped, the east gate, where the ribbon had been found. The stone gatepost was bare now, rain-washed and ordinary. Holmes looked at it for a moment, and Watson looked at Holmes, and Miss Marple looked at the elm. "She will be all right, I think," Miss Marple said, not addressing it to either of them specifically. "She has done what she came to do. She is a practical person. You can tell from the needlework. Practical people find it easier to move on once the practical matter is resolved." A pause. "She may stay in the village for a little while. She may go. I shall leave that entirely to her." Holmes said, "You will keep an eye out." Miss Marple said, "I always do," with the mild, perfectly composed manner of someone stating the obvious. The platform at St. Mary Mead Station had returned to its regular self. The hanging baskets in their dignified decline, the porter with his trolley, the small, precise world of a provincial station going about its morning with no particular drama and no intention of acquiring any. Holmes and Watson stood with their bags, and Miss Marple stood with her umbrella, and they said the things that are said at station platforms, that it had been productive, that the journey down had been comfortable, that they hoped her garden was not too badly affected by the rain, that she must send word if anything further developed. Then Holmes said, without preamble, "I should like to ask you something, Miss Marple." She looked at him. "You read people the way I read crime scenes," he said. "Every detail, every inconsistency, everything that doesn't quite fit. You have been doing it for a very long time, and you do it without instruments or method in the formal sense. And yet, the conclusions are as precise as anything I produce." He paused. "How did you learn it?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, with the quality of someone considering not the answer. She knew the answer, but whether the answer would be useful to the person asking. Then she said, "I grew up in a village. A village is simply a city made small enough to see clearly. The same vanities, the same griefs, the same small cruelties, and the same remarkable kindnesses, all compressed into a space where you cannot avoid noticing them. I noticed them. I kept noticing them. And after a great many years, I found that almost everything I encountered, wherever I encountered it, was a version of something I had already seen." She looked at him with the direct, warm, slightly amused expression that was characteristic of her. "You read crime scenes because you have trained yourself to see what others overlook. I read people because I have simply been paying attention for a very long time." Holmes considered this for a moment. "That is a better method than mine," he said. "In certain respects." "In certain respects," she agreed. "Yours is better than mine. That is why this worked." The train announced itself at the end of the platform with a distant whistle and the sound of steam, and the porter began to move with increased purpose. Watson picked up his bag and looked at Miss Marple, who was standing in her grey coat, with her umbrella and her composed, untroubled expression, looking entirely like what she was, a small, neat, white-haired woman at a provincial station, seeing guests off, already thinking about her garden. "It has been a privilege," Watson said, and meant it. Miss Marple smiled at him, a genuine smile, warm and direct. "Do give my regards to Mrs. Hudson," she said. "I have always had great admiration for a woman who manages that household with such equanimity." Watson laughed, and was still smiling when he stepped onto the train. The countryside on sea. The return journey was the same countryside, reversed, the fields and hedgerows and small stations passing in the other direction. The light later now and lower, the shadows longer in the October afternoon. Holmes sat with his notebook closed on his knee and his eyes on the window, and Watson wrote in his journal with the quiet pleasure of a man who has a good story, and the words coming easily. He wrote the facts first, as he always did, the chalk figures, the cipher, the ledger, the ribbon. Then he wrote the shape of it, the long patience of a grief, the village's careful memory, the two women carrying their separate versions of the same wrong thing across 30 years, without ever speaking of it, like passengers on parallel trains going in the same direction without knowing. He wrote, "There are cases that end with an arrest, and cases that end with a resolution, and the two are not always the same thing. This was the second kind. The cipher said, 'Remember,' and in the end, that is what happened. The record was corrected. The name was spoken. The ribbon remained in the past, but the acknowledgement of it was added to the present, where it could sit quietly in a ledger in a vestry in a small English village for as long as anyone cared to look. He paused and looked at Holmes, who was still watching the window. Then he wrote. Holmes asked Miss Marple how she had learned to read people. I think the answer surprised him, though he would not say so. It surprised me in the way that the simplest answers sometimes do, the ones that turn out to have been available all along, requiring nothing more than time and the willingness to pay attention. A village is simply a city, made small enough to see clearly. I have been writing about crime and detection for many years, and I believe that is the most accurate thing I have heard either craft described as. The train moved through the last of the countryside and into the first suburbs, and the suburbs thickened into the city, and the light on the carriage walls shifted from the long amber of afternoon countryside to the shorter, busier, more various light of London. Gas lamps were coming on as they pulled into Paddington, the station roof receiving them with its familiar iron and steam grandeur, the sounds of the city reasserting themselves, wheels and voices and distant whistles, and the general, inexhaustible noise of a place that never entirely sleeps. Holmes stood and took his bag down and said, "A satisfactory case, Watson." Watson said, "A good one, I think." Holmes considered. "Yes," he said, "a good one." They stepped off the train and into the London evening, and the crowd moved around them, and the lamps made their steady orange pools on the wet platform stones. And somewhere above the station roof the city spread in all its vast, indifferent, endlessly compelling complexity, full of its griefs and its kindnesses and its long memories and its willingness to carry things for decades, without being asked. Watson put his notebook in his coat pocket and thought about a ledger in a vestry in St. Mary Mead, with a new entry in careful handwriting on the last written page, adding a small, permanent correction to the record. It was enough, he thought. It was quite enough. And so Watson's journal closes on this one, a mystery written in chalk and memory, in ribbons and old ledgers, in the long patience of a name that refused to be forgotten. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope this carried you somewhere quiet. Sleep well. I'll keep the lamp on.